In January 1941, less than a year before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat down and wrote a letter. Not a military briefing, not a strategic plan. A personal letter to a friend, a Japanese politician named Sasakawa, who had recently visited the Navy and come away impressed. Sasakawa had publicly declared his confidence in the Japanese military, saying that with a man like Yamamoto in charge, Japan could not possibly fail against America. Yamamoto's response was extraordinary. He sat down and warned Sasakawa that he was dangerously mistaken, not to be rude, but because Yamamoto understood something that almost nobody else in Japan wanted to hear, that Japan couldn't win. What happened to this letter is a story about how truth gets distorted in wartime, how prophecy gets weaponized, and how one man was forced to plan the very war he knew would destroy his nation. It's also the story of the most powerful military prediction in World War II and how almost nobody understood what it really meant. This is the true story of Admiral Yamamoto's letter. Isoroku Yamamoto was born on April 4, 1884, with the name that literally means 56. His father was 56 when he was born and decided to make that his son's name. He grew up in an era of transformation. Japan was emerging from centuries of isolation, rapidly modernizing, building a military that rivaled the great powers of Europe. As a young man, Yamamoto entered the Imperial Naval Academy in 1904. He was part of the generation that would build Japan's navy into one of the world's most formidable forces. At just 20 years old, he saw combat in the Russo-Japanese War. At the Battle of Tsushima, his ship was hit by Russian shells. Shrapnel tore into his body. When he recovered consciousness, he discovered that 2 fingers had been blown off his left hand. He would carry that wound for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the cost of war. But despite his wound, or perhaps because of it, young Yamamoto climbed through the ranks. He studied gunnery, then switched to naval aviation when it was still controversial to do so. He commanded ships. He commanded entire fleets. And along the way, something crucial happened. He left Japan. In 1926, Yamamoto was assigned as a naval attaché to the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. He spent 2 years living in America, not as a diplomat or spy, but as a military observer. What he saw terrified him. Yamamoto watched American industrial capacity. He saw the sheer scale of American production. He understood in a way that few Japanese officers did that. America's wealth and manufacturing power were almost incomprehensible. He attended Harvard, he traveled, he made American friends. He learned English. And the deeper he went into American culture, the more convinced he became of a simple, unavoidable truth: Japan could never defeat America in a prolonged war. When he returned to Japan in 1927, Yamamoto brought this knowledge with him, and for the next 14 years he tried to warn his government. As Japan's military ambitions grew, as the army pushed further into China, as the government grew more aggressive, as the alliance with Nazi Germany solidified, Yamamoto became increasingly vocal in his opposition. He opposed the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. He opposed the full-scale invasion of China in 1937. He opposed the tripartite pact with Nazi Germany and Italy in 1940, which he saw as a catastrophic mistake that would inevitably lead to war with America, and his opposition made him enemies. The militarists who controlled Japan's government saw Yamamoto as an obstacle, a pessimist, a defeatist. They sent him hate mail. Death threats arrived regularly. Young officers from the army, radical nationalists who believed in Japan's divine right to dominate Asia, wanted him eliminated. Yamamoto accepted this danger with the calm of a trained soldier. When asked about the possibility of assassination, he said simply, "To die for emperor and nation is the highest hope of a military man. After a brave, hard fight, the blossoms are scattered on the fighting field." He meant it, but it didn't stop him from trying to prevent the war. By 1940, Yamamoto had risen to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet. It was the most powerful position in the military outside of the direct government. And he used that power to try one more time to change Japan's course. In January 1941, Diet member Sasakawa Ryoichi returned from an inspection of the Yokosuka naval base. He had spent time with the fleet, watched their exercises, been briefed on their capabilities. Sasakawa was impressed, more than impressed. He was overwhelmed. Publicly, he declared that with a commander like Admiral Yamamoto in charge of the Navy, Japan had nothing to fear from America. The Japanese forces were simply too well-trained, too disciplined, too superior. When Yamamoto heard this, he knew he had to respond, not to attack Sasakawa, but to educate him, to warn him. On January 24, 1941, Yamamoto picked up his pen and wrote a response. In his elegant, precise handwriting, he composed a letter that was part warning, part prophecy, part desperate plea. The letter opened with gratitude. Yamamoto thanked Sasakawa for the confidence he had expressed in the Navy, but then came the warning. Should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even if we occupy Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. Let that sink in. Yamamoto was saying that the only way Japan could truly defeat America was an impossible scenario, conquering the entire United States, marching across the continent, and forcing America to surrender in its own capital. He continued, and here was the key moment of the letter, the moment where Yamamoto's concern turned to something deeper. I wonder if our politicians, who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war, have confidence as to the outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. This wasn't a boast. This wasn't Yamamoto saying Japan would conquer Washington. This was Yamamoto asking sarcastically whether Japan's politicians understood the impossible task they were proposing. And then, near the end, Yamamoto wrote something even more explicit. He said that war with America was a terrible idea, that it would require Japan to sacrifice everything with almost no chance of victory. The letter ended with Yamamoto signing his name. But the message was unmistakable. Japan was about to make a catastrophic mistake. But here's what happened next, and this is where the story takes a darker turn. Yamamoto sent the letter to Sasakawa as a personal warning. It was supposed to be private. It was supposed to be between them. Instead, Sasakawa shared it widely. And when it was shared, something extraordinary happened. Japanese propaganda machine got hold of it. The militarists who controlled Japan's government saw an opportunity. They took Yamamoto's warning and twisted it. They removed the context. They removed his warnings about the impossibility of victory. And they extracted a single phrase. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. Then they added one simple word, I, instead of we would have to, and they changed the meaning entirely. The Japanese people were told that Admiral Yamamoto, their greatest naval commander, had promised that Japan would march into Washington and dictate peace in the White House itself, that this was their destiny, that with Yamamoto in command, victory was assured. Yamamoto's warning about an impossible war had been inverted into a promise of inevitable victory. When Yamamoto learned how his letter had been perverted, he was furious. But there was nothing he could do. The military government controlled the media. The propaganda machine was too powerful to resist. In July 1941, Prime Minister Tojo Hideki made the final decision. Japan would attack America. There was no turning back. And the man assigned to plan that attack was the one man in Japan who understood with absolute certainty that the war could not be won, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was in an impossible position. As a military officer, he had to follow orders. He could not refuse a direct command from the Prime Minister. To do so would mean being relieved of command, possibly court-martialed, maybe executed. But he knew the war was a disaster waiting to happen. His response was to do what he had done throughout his career. He tried to minimize the damage. If Japan was going to fight America and he had to accept that it was, then Yamamoto would ensure that Japan struck the hardest possible opening blow. Maybe, just maybe, if they could cripple the American Navy in a single attack, they could negotiate peace before America recovered. Yamamoto began planning what would become the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was bold. It was unprecedented. Hundreds of aircraft attacking from carriers hundreds of miles away. Midget submarines slipping into the harbor. A coordinated assault designed to destroy the American Pacific Fleet in a single day. And the attack, when it came, was devastatingly successful. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. American ships were sunk. The American Pacific Fleet was crippled. Thousands of Americans were killed. For a moment, it seemed like Yamamoto's gamble might have worked. Japan's initial offensive across the Pacific was wildly successful. Territory fell rapidly. Resources were captured. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. But here's what's crucial. Yamamoto's attack had failed in one critical objective. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor when the attack came. They had been at sea. And for Yamamoto, who understood that carrier warfare was the future of naval combat, their survival was a catastrophe. The day after Pearl Harbor, officers in the Japanese Navy were celebrating. Japan had struck a decisive blow. The Navy was triumphant. Victory seemed possible. But Yamamoto was not celebrating. A witness reported that on December 8, 1941, Yamamoto sat alone in apparent depression. While his officers were jubilant, Yamamoto was despondent. He knew what had really happened at Pearl Harbor. Japan had awakened America's fury, and America was far too powerful to be defeated. In his heart, he knew the war was already lost. But worse was coming. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto attempted to exploit Japan's numerical advantage and conquest of vast territories. He believed or hoped that if Japan could secure adequate resources, establish a strong defensive perimeter, and negotiate with America from a position of strength, maybe, just maybe, a negotiated peace might be possible. But something crucial happened. The American Navy recovered faster than anyone expected. American ships that had been damaged at Pearl Harbor were repaired and returned to service. New ships were built. The American industrial machine, which Yamamoto had witnessed firsthand in his years in Washington, was producing vessels at a rate Japan could never match. And then came the moment Yamamoto had been predicting all along. In June 1942, exactly 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese and American navies clashed near a small atoll called Midway Island. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days. It was the largest naval battle in history, and when it was over, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers had been sunk. Japan had lost its naval advantage. The initiative in the Pacific War shifted permanently to the United States. Yamamoto watched as the battle unfolded, unable to change the outcome from his command ship. When the scale of the disaster became apparent, he attempted to continue the fight, but it was too late. The moment had passed. In the aftermath of Midway, Yamamoto made a statement that has echoed through history. A statement that proved he had seen the future with remarkable clarity. If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year. But I have absolutely no confidence about the 2nd and 3rd years. He had said this before the war, but it took on new meaning after Midway. For exactly 6 months, Japan's navy had run wild. They had conquered vast territories, won every battle, seemed unstoppable. And then, precisely as Yamamoto had predicted, it all changed. The timeline was so accurate that it seemed almost supernatural. Yamamoto hadn't just predicted that Japan would lose. He had predicted almost exactly when the tide would turn. But Yamamoto didn't have time to watch the rest of his prophecy unfold. After Midway, the war became a grinding, losing battle for Japan. The Americans slowly pushed forward, island by island. Japan lost battle after battle, the losses mounted, the navy was crippled, the homeland was being bombed with increasing intensity. Yamamoto continued as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, but his authority was increasingly undermined. The politicians and army officers who had so confidently declared that Japan would march into Washington were now desperate and grasping. Yamamoto was worn down by the war he had never wanted to fight. His health was deteriorating. The stress of command, combined with his decades of service and the knowledge that his prophecies were coming true, aged him rapidly. In April 1943, Yamamoto made a decision to conduct an inspection of the forward bases. He wanted to see the state of the fleet, to understand what resources were available, to assess the situation for himself. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's aircraft, a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, took off for the first leg of his inspection tour. What Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans had intercepted his travel plans. The US military intelligence had learned exactly when and where Yamamoto would be flying. The Americans faced a decision. Was it worth risking a combat mission to kill one man? The answer was yes. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the greatest naval strategist Japan possessed, was too valuable a target to ignore. American P-38 fighters were scrambled. They flew out to intercept Yamamoto's transport. The intercept was perfectly calculated time to meet Yamamoto's plane near Bougainville Island. When the American fighters appeared, Yamamoto's transport plane had no chance. It was not a combat aircraft, it was a transport, slow and vulnerable. The P-38s attacked. Yamamoto's aircraft was hit repeatedly. It caught fire and spiraled downward. The plane crashed into the jungle below. Yamamoto was killed instantly. He never lived to see the end of the war. He never saw Japan's total defeat. He never knew exactly how far his prophecy would extend, that Japan would indeed lose not just the war, but its empire, its military power, and its position as a great power, But the man who planned the attack that was supposed to win the war had died knowing with absolute certainty that his nation had already lost. After the war, something remarkable happened to Yamamoto's legacy. The letter he had written in January 1941, the letter that had been twisted and perverted by Japanese propaganda, now became something else entirely. American military analysts and historians began examining Yamamoto's writings. They found the original letter to Sasakawa, and they recognized it for what it actually was, not a boast, but a warning. Yamamoto's reputation was rehabilitated. In Japan, where he had been vilified for years as the man who started the war, he became a tragic figure, a military genius who had seen the future, tried to prevent the war, and been forced to fight it anyway. In the decades that followed, scholars and military historians have returned again and again to Yamamoto's writings. They've examined his letters, they've analyzed his predictions, and the conclusion has been consistent. Yamamoto understood the Pacific War better than almost anyone, not just as a military commander, but as a strategic analyst who grasped the fundamental economic and industrial realities that made Japanese victory impossible. The irony of Yamamoto's life is almost Shakespearean. He was the man who understood Japan's situation most clearly. He was the one voice that tried to warn his nation against catastrophe. And yet he was forced to lead that very catastrophe. He was overruled by politicians who were motivated by nationalism and imperial ambitions. He was overshadowed by military factions who believed in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior. He was vilified for his skepticism in a culture that demanded optimism and certainty. And when his predictions came true, when Japan's initial advantage evaporated after exactly 6 months, when the industrial might of America proved overwhelming, when Japan found itself fighting a grinding war of attrition it could not win, nobody thanked Yamamoto for his foresight. Instead, he was already dead, killed by the enemy he had warned Japan against. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was many things. He was a military genius. He was a man of principle who tried to save his nation from self-destruction. He was a fatalist who accepted his fate with grace. But above all, He was a man who understood something that his leaders refused to accept, that some wars cannot be won, no matter how brave your soldiers are or how noble your cause. The attack on Pearl Harbor was his idea, executed brilliantly, but it was also the beginning of Japan's destruction. Yamamoto knew this. He tried to explain it. He wrote letters warning against it. And when he was overruled, he did his duty as a military officer. He planned the attack. He led the war. He died fighting. Today, more than 80 years later, historians still debate what would have happened if Yamamoto had lived. Would Japan have continued fighting? Would the war have ended differently? Would the atomic bombs have been necessary? Nobody knows. But what we do know is this: Yamamoto saw the future, and he was right. The letter he wrote in January 1941 was not a boast. It was a warning. And the only people who truly understood that warning were the ones who read it after the war was over. By then, Yamamoto was gone. Japan was destroyed. Millions were dead. And the prophecy that Yamamoto had tried to prevent had come true in ways even he could not have fully imagined.